December 16th, 1985, 5:25 p.m. Paul Castellano stepped out of his Lincoln Town car in front of Sparks Steakhouse in the heart of Manhattan. Christmas lights twinkled on the buildings around him. Holiday shoppers filled the sidewalks. It was rush hour in Midtown, and the streets buzzed with yellow cabs and the hum of a city alive. Big Paul, as they called him, was 70 years old. Boss of the Gambino crime family, the most powerful mafia organization in America. Worth millions, untouchable, or so he thought. His driver and bodyguard, Thomas Bellotti, killed the engine and stepped out first. Bellotti was loyal, tough, and always alert. He'd taken a bullet for Castellano before, and he'd do it again. Neither man saw the four assassins waiting by the restaurant entrance. All four wore identical outfits, long white trench coats and Russian-style fur hats, like a death squad out of a spy novel. They blended into the Christmas crowd perfectly until they didn't. As Castellano straightened his tie and began walking toward the restaurant, the gunman moved. Bang, 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 bang. 6 bullets tore through Paul Castellano. He collapsed on the sidewalk next to a lamppost, his blood pooling on the concrete as Christmas shoppers screamed and scattered. Bellotti heard the shots. He spun around, reaching for his gun, but he never had a chance. One of the assassins came up behind him and put a bullet in the back of his head. Tommy Bellotti dropped into the street, dead before he hit the ground. The whole thing took less than 15 seconds. 4 men in white coats, 2 bodies, hundreds of witnesses. And nobody did a damn thing because by the time anyone realized what happened, the killers had already vanished into the Manhattan crowd like ghosts. But across the street, parked in a black Lincoln with tinted windows, sat the man who'd orchestrated the entire hit, John Gotti. And next to him, calmly watching the carnage unfold through the passenger window, was his most trusted soldier, Sammy the Bull Gravano. Gotti turned the ignition. The engine purred to life. He drove slowly past the restaurant, past the bodies, past the chaos, just to make sure Big Paul was dead. Gravano looked down at Bellotti's lifeless body sprawled in the street. "He's gone," Gravano muttered. Gotti nodded. No words, just a slight smile. And just like that, the old boss was dead. John Gotti was now the king of New York. To understand what happened that night outside Sparks Steakhouse, you need to understand who Paul Castellano was and why John Gotti wanted him dead. Paul Castellano wasn't your typical gangster. He didn't hang out in social clubs. He didn't work the streets. He lived in a massive mansion on Staten Island that the tabloids called the White House. He wore expensive suits, drove luxury cars, and ran the Gambino family like a CEO runs a corporation. Castellano was all about money, construction rackets, unions, legitimate-looking businesses. He believed in keeping a low profile, staying out of the headlines, and making millions quietly. But there was one thing Big Paul hated more than anything else: drugs. Castellano had a strict rule. Nobody in the Gambino family dealt narcotics. If you got caught selling drugs, you were dead. No exceptions. It wasn't because Paul had a moral objection to drugs. He just knew that drug cases brought federal heat, and federal heat meant wiretaps, indictments, and RICO charges. Drugs were bad for business. But here's the problem. Half the family was making a fortune selling heroin and cocaine, and one of those guys was Angelo Ruggiero, one of John Gotti's closest friends. In 1983, the FBI planted bugs inside Ruggiero's house. For months they recorded everything, and what they heard was pure gold. Detailed conversations about drug deals, murders, and the inner workings of the Gambino family. When Castellano found out about the tapes, he was furious. He demanded that Ruggiero hand them over so he could see what was on them. But Ruggiero refused. Why? Because those tapes didn't just implicate him. They implicated John Gotti, too. Castellano's underboss at the time was a man named Agnello della Croce. Neil, as everyone called him, was old-school Mafia. He was tough, respected, and beloved by the soldiers on the street, including Gotti. Neil had always been the buffer between Castellano and the younger, more violent faction of the family. He kept the peace. He protected guys like Gotti and Ruggiero. But Neil was dying. Lung cancer was eating him alive, and everyone knew he didn't have much time left. On December 2nd, 1985, just 2 weeks before the hit at Sparks, Neil Della Croce died. And that's when everything fell apart. When Neil Della Croce died, the entire Gambino family expected Paul Castellano to attend the wake. It was tradition. It was respect. It was the Mafia code. But Castellano didn't show up. He claimed he couldn't go because he was under federal indictment and the FBI would be watching. He said it was too risky. He stayed home in his mansion on Staten Island. To John Gotti, that was the ultimate disrespect. Neil Della Croce had been Gotti's mentor, his protector, the man who'd vouched for him when he became a made man. And now Castellano couldn't even be bothered to show his face at the wake. That was it. Gotti had had enough. But it wasn't just about respect. Gotti knew he was in danger. Without Neil around to protect him, Gotti feared Castellano would come after him and his crew over those wiretaps. There were whispers that Big Paul was planning to break up Gotti's entire operation and possibly kill Ruggiero, maybe even Gotti himself. Gotti believed he had two options: kill Castellano or be killed by him. He chose the former. But there was a problem. According to the rules of the Mafia, you can't just kill a boss. Hits on bosses required approval from the Commission, the ruling body of all 5 New York Mafia families. Gotti didn't have that approval, and he didn't care. John Gotti couldn't do this alone. He needed allies. He needed a crew. And most importantly, he needed someone on the inside, someone close to Castellano who could set him up. That person was Frank DeCicco. Frank DeCicco was a high-ranking captain in the Gambino family and one of Castellano's most trusted advisors. But DeCicco had grown tired of Big Paul's leadership. He felt Castellano was out of touch, greedy, and more concerned with making money than taking care of the soldiers who actually did the dirty work. DeCicco agreed to help Gotti, but only if they brought in someone with serious muscle and credibility. That's where Sammy the Bull Gravano came in. Gravano was a rising star in the Gambino family. He was a feared killer, a smart businessman, and a man other mobsters respected. If Sammy signed on to the hit, it meant the conspiracy was real, not just Gotti's ego running wild. Gravano had his own reasons for wanting Castellano gone. Big Paul had never shown Sammy the respect he thought he deserved. And like Gotti, Gravano believed Castellano's days were numbered anyway, with all the federal heat closing in. Better to take control now than wait for everything to collapse. So Gravano agreed. Now they had a plan. DeCicco would set up a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse and make sure Castellano and Bellotti showed up. Gotti would recruit a hit squad to carry out the murder, and Gravano would be there with Gotti to make sure everything went smoothly. The hit was scheduled for December 16th, 1985 at 5:25 p.m. Gotti assembled a team of 4 shooters. All were tough, experienced killers who wouldn't hesitate when the moment came. The alleged shooters were Salvatore Scala, Edward Lino, John Carneglia, and one more whose identity has never been confirmed. These men weren't just random thugs. They were seasoned Gambino soldiers who'd been involved in murders before. They knew how to handle a gun. They knew how to disappear. On the evening of December 16th, the four hitmen arrived at Sparks Steakhouse, dressed in those now infamous white trench coats and Russian fur hats. The outfits served a purpose. They made the men look like a group, a unit, not individual killers. Witnesses would remember the coats and hats, not the faces. Meanwhile, Gotti and Gravano parked their car on the corner of 3rd Avenue and East 46th Street, facing the restaurant. They had a clear view of the entrance. They had walkie-talkies to communicate with the hit squad. All they had to do now was wait. At 5:25 p.m., Castellano's black Lincoln Town car pulled up in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Gravano spotted it first. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and alerted the shooters. "He's here." Paul Castellano stepped out of the passenger side. Thomas Bellotti stepped out of the driver's side. Neither man saw it coming. The four assassins moved in fast. 6 shots rang out. Castellano crumpled to the sidewalk. Bellotti tried to defend his boss, but before he could even draw his weapon, one of the shooters came up behind him and executed him with a single shot to the head. It was over in seconds. The gunmen calmly walked away, blending into the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, as if nothing had happened. Nobody stopped them. Nobody chased them. They simply vanished. Gotti and Gravano watched from their car. Gotti put the car in drive and slowly rolled past the scene. He wanted to see the bodies with his own eyes. He wanted to make sure Big Paul was really dead. Gravano looked down at Bellotti's body lying in the street. "He's gone," he said. Gotti smiled. Mission accomplished. Within hours, the news spread through the underworld like wildfire. Paul Castellano, boss of the Gambino family, was dead. Murdered in broad daylight in the middle of Manhattan during rush hour. It was the first mob boss hit in New York City in decades, and everyone knew who was behind it. John Gotti. But the FBI couldn't prove it. Not yet. Gotti was smart. He'd kept his hands clean. He hadn't pulled the trigger. He'd watched from a distance. And the shooters? They disappeared without a trace. Gotti was called in for questioning, but he played it cool. He smiled. He cracked jokes. He acted like he had nothing to hide. And incredibly, the charges didn't stick. Over the next few years, the feds would try to bring down Gotti multiple times, but every time, he walked free. Witnesses mysteriously changed their stories. Jurors got bribed. Tapes went missing. The media started calling him the Teflon Don because nothing stuck to him. But it wasn't Teflon. It was jury tampering, witness intimidation, and sheer arrogance. Gotti loved the attention. Unlike Castellano, who'd hidden in his mansion, Gotti thrived in the spotlight. He wore $2,000 suits. He waved to the cameras. He held court at the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy like a celebrity. The tabloids ate it up. Gotti became a household name, the mob boss who couldn't be touched. But there was one man who knew the truth. One man who'd been there from the beginning, who'd watched Gotti rise to power, who'd helped him kill Paul Castellano. Sammy, the Bull, Gravano. And eventually, Sammy would be the one to bring Gotti down. By 1990, the FBI was closing in on Gotti again. This time, they had something they'd never had before. Wiretaps. Hundreds of hours of recordings from bugs planted in the Ravenite Social Club and Gotti's apartments. And on those tapes, they heard Gotti talking. A lot. He talked about murders. He talked about rackets. And worst of all, he talked about Sammy Gravano. In one conversation, Gotti complained about Gravano behind his back, suggesting that if anyone was going to take the fall for their crimes, it should be Sammy, not him. When the FBI played those tapes for Gravano, something inside him snapped. Gravano had been loyal to Gotti for years. He'd helped him kill Castellano. He'd run operations for him. He'd taken risks for him. And now Gotti was willing to throw him under the bus to save himself. Sammy the Bull Gravano made a decision that would change Mafia history forever. He flipped. In November 1991, Gravano's lawyer approached federal prosecutors with an offer. Sammy would testify against John Gotti in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecutors couldn't believe it. Gravano was the underboss of the Gambino family, the second highest-ranking member. No one at that level had ever cooperated with the government before, but Gravano was serious. On March 2nd, 1992, Sammy the Bull Gravano took the stand in a Brooklyn federal courthouse and testified against his former boss. For 9 days, Gravano laid it all out. He described the Castellano hit in detail. He named the shooters. He explained how he and Gotti had sat in the car and watched the murder unfold. He admitted to 19 murders, including several ordered by Gotti. Gotti sat in the courtroom the entire time, staring at Gravano with a cold, fixed smile. But inside, he had to know it was over. On April 2nd, 1992, after just 14 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Gotti guilty on all counts: murder, racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, and more. On June 23, 1992, Gotti was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Teflon was gone. As the FBI's James Fox famously said, "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered with Velcro, and all the charges stuck." John Gotti spent the rest of his life in federal prison. He was held in near-total isolation, allowed out of his cell for just 1 hour a day. He died of throat cancer on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61. Sammy Gravano, in exchange for his testimony, served just 5 years in prison despite admitting to 19 murders. After his release, he entered the Witness Protection Program, but eventually left it, became a media personality, and even started a podcast. The Castellano murder outside Sparks Steakhouse remains one of the most brazen mob hits in American history. It wasn't done in a dark alley or a secluded warehouse. It was done in the middle of Manhattan, during rush hour, in front of hundreds of witnesses. And the man who ordered it, John Gotti, became the most famous mobster in America. But fame has a price. Gotti's need for the spotlight, his refusal to stay quiet, his arrogance, all of it contributed to his downfall. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the Teflon would last forever. But in the end, it was his own underboss, the man who'd helped him rise to power, who brought him crashing down. Loyalty in the Mafia is a myth. In the end, it's every man for himself. If this story got you hooked, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're dropping these mob stories every week, and trust me, the next one is even crazier. Drop a comment below. Do you think Gotti deserved what he got? Was Sammy right to flip, or was he a rat? Hit that notification bell because next week we're telling the story of how Lucky Luciano created the modern mafia and changed organized crime forever. Remember, in the world of the mob, there's no such thing as honor. There's only power, betrayal, and survival. And the ones who survive are the ones who see the bullet coming before it's fired.